How would Jesus tax? Hi, I'm Dave Arnott, the Christian Economist. This week we take on the question of taxing, and I've drawn upon a statement that was popular when I was in college. People were wearing armbands that said, "What would Jesus do?" Well, then how would Jesus tax? What would he suggest we do? Well, in a forthcoming book by Dave Arnott and Sergei Saidamatov, we outline the 10 Commandments of economics, and so we look at those to try to determine whether we should tax or not tax at all. Well, those against taxing are our 10 Commandments of economics rule number 1, people should be free. Taxing removes people's freedom. If you don't have your own private property, then you're not free. And of the 10, we look at the second one, which is don't steal. You'll recognize this one. It comes from the real 10 Commandments, but it's also part of our 10 Commandments of economics, which says you shouldn't steal. Well, this assumes that there's some right of private property. If there wasn't right of private property, why would the commandment say don't steal? Those are the things against taxing, but perhaps the biggest one is, as Christians, we are often told to give. There is no commandment to take. You can look through all the Old and New Testament. I had a grad student do it one time and came back with 42 uses of the word take in the Old and New Testament. And most of them had to do with take up your cross and follow me. It had nothing to do with the economics. There's only one, by the way, that did. The day before Jesus was tried, he sent one of his disciples into Jerusalem and said, "You will find a donkey. Take the donkey." That's the only time in which the word take is used in economic terms in the Old and New Testament. We believe Jesus was God, so if God tells you to take, perhaps it's okay. But do you see the point? See, taxing is taking from people against their will. And so as an absolute rule, we think it's a bad idea. Now, the arguments for taxing. Again, the 10 Commandments of economics from Arnott and Saidamatov. One of them is honor those in power. Well, when those in power demand taxes, we believe as Christians we should do what we're ordered to do. And of course, this comes from the render unto Caesar statement that Jesus said when they were trying to trap him about the image on the coin. So then looking at our Christian worldview, I have said in podcast number 34, no utopia. There is no utopia. We are not in a perfect world. We are east of Eden and short of heaven. In the fallen world, we can't expect perfection. We believe that taxes are part of that imperfection, and so we have to pay them until Jesus comes back or we go to heaven. We are in an imperfect world. Taxes are a representation of that. So how do we collect taxes? Well, when we look at it in the economics textbooks, we find two words. Taxes should be efficient and they should be equal. Meaning it should be easy to collect them. There should be a low expense for collecting them. And across a spectrum, people who make about the same amount should pay about the same amount of tax. There should be something in terms of equality. We look at those two things, okay? Well, if you caught me in an elevator recently, I would have said because of the increase in the money supply, the value of the dollar will go down. Also, because of the increase in the stimulus spending, taxes will go up. Well, this is a pretty easy prediction to make. In my classroom, we look at the U.S. debt clock, which you can look up online if you want. U.S. debt clock scares you to death. Are we spending too much? Oh, yeah. I mean, this is astounding. My sophomores were born in the year 2000. At that time, the U.S. debt to GDP, which is the right way of measuring the ratio, was 56% when they were born. When they entered college as a freshman 18 months ago, it had doubled to 104, almost doubled to 104% debt to GDP. I was just making up the quiz yesterday and looked it up. You know what the answer is now? They've been in college for 18 months. The debt to GDP has gone from 104% to 137%. This is unsustainable. I have a whole program on national debt, podcast number 8. But even since I've recorded that, it's become so extreme. As I'm recording this second day of October 2020, the House is trying to pass a bill, a $2.2 trillion stimulus. Let's see if my math is right. That will make the debt to GDP ratio go from 137 to somewhere 143 in 1 week. This is unsustainable. My purpose is not to talk about debt today, which should scare you to death, by the way, but to talk about taxes. Taxes will go up. This is an absolute. There's just no question they have to go up. My question is, as a Christian economist, how should we collect these taxes? Okay, so we understand from Ludwig von Mises, who wrote the book called Human Action, one of the first books in economics, that people respond to incentives. And so we should put the incentive where we want it to be. One of my students actually asked it this week. Shouldn't we reward what we want more of and punish what we want less of? In a conversation about taxes, I said, yes, we should, but we do not. And he's asking a really good question. It comes straight from von Mises, which is human action. People respond to incentives. So let's put the incentives where we want them to be. Okay? Well, there's 3 ways to look at this. In general categories, because I only have 13 minutes today, you can collect taxes via 3 measures. One is the current income tax. Second is a flat income tax. Third is a fair tax, which is a sales tax. Let's go through these very quickly, right? So currently in the United States, we have a progressive income tax. It is the most progressive income tax in the world. That is absolutely clear. It's absolutely a fact, meaning the Germans and the French and the Japanese, boy, would they love to live in America if they're poor. Because they're poor pay a much higher percentage of the income tax than the poor in America. This is an article from Laura Saunders writing in the Wall Street Journal, who says how progressive this tax is. The top 1% of Americans in income pay 43% of the tax. Even more important, the top 0.1% of income earners in America pay 22% of the income tax that gets paid. Somewhere around 50% of Americans pay no income tax at all. Laura Sanders actually says it's 60. I thought it was around 47, but I don't know. She published it in the Wall Street Journal. She said the bottom 60% pay no income tax. I'll be careful and use my number 47. Pay no income tax at all. And so this is interesting. Every time you hear there's a tax cut, somebody will claim, it's a tax cut for the rich. Well, of course it is. It has to be a tax cut for the top 53%, because the bottom 47% pay no tax. And when you get into the details, you find the fourth quintile pays -1, and the fifth quintile pays -2, but I think I hear myself having said that in a previous podcast, so I'll leave it now and try to get back to this question. How would Jesus tax? The progressive income tax is extremely progressive. Going back to von Mises' Human Action, we are concerned, as taxes go up, will people leave? Well, certainly some will leave. The only question is how many. If you understand the Laffer curve, he says above a certain percentage, people will work less. I adopt the idea from Ayn Rand's book called Atlas Shrugged. Atlas was the Greek mythological character who held up the world. And her point was, at some place along this spectrum, Atlas will shrug. And Laffer drew this curve many years ago on a napkin, and it's become popularized. The best data shows us from Cynthia Romer, who was in the Obama administration. Her number was 33. She said when income taxes get above 33%, people will shrug. They will stop working as hard. And that's why my student asked me this week, why do we punish what we want? Which is behavior, which is income. You want people to make more income. And so that is the problem with the progressive income tax. First, we look at 2 things, as I said, efficiency and equality. It is not equal at all. I just explained to you how the top 1% pay 43% of the tax. And they don't make that much of the income, by the way. They make 16%. Go to the top 0.1%. As I mentioned, they pay 22% of the federal income tax. And they make 7.6% of the income. And even after redistribution, it gets worse. I mean, don't even bother me about that. So our point is the progressive tax, first, it's very unequitable. And second, it is very inefficient. It is very expensive to collect this income tax, as you know, because you file taxes every year, and it's very, very difficult to do. And the problem is, this gets more progressive. People will leave. I worked in pro tennis the first 6 years of my career, and Bjorn Borg was one of the best players during that time period. From Sweden, but he didn't live in Sweden. Everybody knew that. He lived in Monaco, where the tax rate was 0, because the Swedish tax rate was too high. Some 6 months ago, the founder of IKEA, IKEA, it's named for him, the initials of his name, and the initials of the community in which he grew up. IK is Ingvar, I may mispronounce it, Ingvar Kamprad, EA is the territory from which he came, much like Los Angeles, like LA, right? IK. He was Swedish, and if you go to IKEA, you see all this Swedish stuff going on. He didn't live in Sweden. He lived in Monaco. Why? Because, if you think of the Lather curve, think of Ayn Rand, Atlas shrugged. Ingvar Kamprad shrugged. He left Sweden. People will leave America. It's not a question whether they will leave. The only question is how many of them will leave. Oregon went through this experiment many years ago. They put a tax on millionaires. When they came to collect the tax the next year, they found that 60% of them went missing. People move. People leave. People respond to incentives. And taxes are a penalty, so they respond to them. Well, I've only gotten through one, which is our current progressive income tax. The second idea is called a fair tax. I'm sorry, the flat tax. The flat is second. Flat means everybody pays the same percentage of their income. Now, for those of you who like progressive income taxes, you don't like that. But after you take economics and you understand consumer surplus and producer surplus, and when you find how did these people get rich? By making others rich. That's what happens in a competitive society. You'll have to refer to some other podcasts on that, but I'm going to assume you know what consumer and producer surplus is. And that to get rich, people have to make others rich. So we should not penalize that. My student asked a really good question. Why do we penalize making others rich? Well, a flat tax would avoid that because everybody would pay the same percentage. The third option is called a fair tax. Well, a fair tax is a sales tax. It taxes consumption. And so I think what Jesus would say is, well, I wish it was a perfect world. I wish there wasn't any tax at all. But it's not a perfect world. There is no utopia. We have to pay tax. We have to forcibly take away people's private property. What is the best way to do that? We should do it in a way that accomplishes what we want. We should punish what we don't want, consumption. We should reward what we want, which is production. One of my podcasts, number 27, policies that promote production. This is all that separates rich from poor countries. It is so simple. However, we have an income tax system that punishes production, meaning making income, and rewards consumption. It's backwards. It should be the other way. I also have a podcast, number 20, called Taxes That Care for Widows and Orphans, in which I make this point, that so many Americans don't pay tax. Widows and orphans don't pay any tax at all. It is only the rich, the top 53%, if you use the latest figures I have, that show those are the only 53% who pay taxes. Okay? Well, that's our subject today. We should, in a fallen world where we know we have to pay tax because things aren't perfect, we should do it in a way that rewards what we want, production, and punishes what we don't want, consumption. Income tax is backwards. The fair tax makes more sense. How would Jesus tax? I think he'd have a consumption tax, which is called a fair or a sales tax. Well, that's it. How would Jesus tax? I'm Dave Arnott, the Christian Economist, where our slogan is, fear God, tell the truth, earn a profit. See you next time.